The War on Poverty After 40 Years, a Minskyan Assessment by Stephanie Bell and L. Randall Wray. The War on Poverty, a Retrospective Assessment. It is, of course, well established that poverty rates fell sharply over the early post-World War II period, which appears to cast some doubt on the structuralist position favored by Minsky. Perhaps rapid post-war growth combined with the supply-side policies of the War on Poverty would be enough, after all, to eliminate poverty. In 1940, well over half and as many as 60% of all white males aged 25 to 64 had earnings that were insufficient to raise a family of 4 out of poverty. This includes those who had no earnings over the year. Farley, 2001. Footnote 1. These data come from a 4-city study of Atlanta, Boston, Detroit, and Los Angeles. End footnote. Among black males of the same age group, fully 90% had earnings below the poverty line for a family of 4. By 1960, comparable figures were around 25% for white males and 50% for black males. Improvement continued until 1970, when 10% of white males and 30% of black males, aged 25 to 64, had earnings insufficient to keep a family of 4 out of poverty. However, falling average real earnings for males, together with lower employment rates, caused poverty, by this measure, to begin to rise after 1970. By 1990, about 20% of white males and more than 40% of black males aged 25 to 64 earned too little to bring a family of 4 out of poverty, similar to the figures for 1965, when the War on Poverty began. Later, we discuss the increasing number of families in which a male is not present. More broadly, U.S. official poverty rates had been declining sharply in the post-war period, even before the war on Poverty, to 15% in 1965. Footnote 2. Data in the next 2 paragraphs are from the U.S. Bureau of the Census, 2004. End footnote. Figure 1 shows poverty rates by race. For both whites and blacks, there is a decline of poverty rates in the mid-1960s, but no improvement subsequently, at least until the Clinton expansion, when black poverty rates improved. Overall, poverty rates finished the millennium back at 12%, the level they had reached in 1968. From these data, it is very hard to discern any positive effect from the War on Poverty. Further, given the long gestation period of supply-side policies, the biggest payoff should have come in the 1980s, precisely when poverty rates rose most sharply. It is true that some of the War on Poverty programs were never fully funded, but one would expect them to have made a larger difference if they represented a valid strategy for alleviating poverty. Figure 2 offers additional detail, displaying poverty rates by age. Here we see sharply falling poverty rates for those aged 65 and above, from nearly 30% in 1966 to 15% by the start of the Nixon recession in 1974, and then falling to just about 10% by the end of the 1990s. In short, poverty among the elderly fell quite remarkably, dropping by half in the first decade of the War on Poverty, and by about 2/3 over the first quarter century. Clearly, this had little to do with the War on Poverty, which was targeted to a younger population, but was due almost entirely to phasing in Social Security and indexing it for inflation. The contrast with younger age groups could not be more striking. The poverty rate of those aged 18 to 64 stood at just over 10% at the beginning of the War on Poverty, rose to about 12.4% under the Reagan presidency, 1983, and finished the millennium back at about 10%. The poverty rate for those under 18 stood at about 17.6% in 1966, rose to 22.3% in 1983 under Reagan, and finished the millennium at 16%. No one looking at this figure could discern much positive impact from the war on poverty. How much of the problem results from joblessness? Table 1 shows that just about 10% of all families in 2002 fell below the poverty line. Footnote 3. Data in this paragraph are from the U.S. Census Bureau 2004. End footnote. Families with no worker experienced a poverty rate of 25.8%. Families with at least one part-time or part-year worker had a poverty rate of 24.8%. On the other hand, families with at least one full-time year-round worker had a poverty rate of only 3.5%. Black families experienced a poverty rate of 21.5%. However, if a black family had no workers, its probability of falling below the poverty line rose to 57.8%. By contrast, a black family with at least one member who worked full-time, full year, experienced a poverty rate of 7.3%. If we raise the poverty bar to 150% of the official poverty line, 17.4% of all families were poor, but families with no members working full-time experienced a poverty rate of 38.5%, while families with at least one member working full-time and full year had a poverty rate of 9.2%. Black families with no working members had a poverty rate at 150% of the poverty line of nearly 72%. These data show how important a full-time, full-year job is for poverty reduction, a relationship that remained as true in 2002 as it was in 1965. Structuralists of the 1960s warned about dynamic structural changes that would generate a more or less permanent job skills mismatch. Has the war on poverty succeeded in substantially reducing this mismatch? The results obtained from a detailed multi-city study of urban inequality are not encouraging. Holzer and Danziger, 2001, used survey data to try to match entry-level jobs with the skills, education, experience, and other characteristics of likely job seekers in 4 major U.S. cities: Atlanta, Boston, Detroit, and Los Angeles. Note that this study excluded all jobs that required a college education. The authors found that for likely job seekers, about between 20% and 37% of white high school dropouts and 12% to 20% of white welfare recipients would experience difficulty in obtaining jobs because of the mismatch of their characteristics and those required by employers. For African Americans and Hispanics, the supply-demand mismatch increases to between 42% and 56% for high school dropouts, and between 27% and 40% for welfare recipients. Finally, our analysis here has focused primarily on employment and earning of males. Women have increased their employment rates and have managed to close the pay gap to some extent. To a very large degree, however, poverty has become feminized among female-headed households. This expanding group has fallen victim to a number of unfavorable circumstances. Along the culprits contributing to the poverty of single-parent, usually mother-only families, are gender inequity in wages, inadequate and poorly enforced child support, extremely low and now disappearing welfare benefits, and a lack of affordable child care. The trend toward raising children in single-parent families undoubtedly arises from many complex factors: declining wages and employment of males, increased incarceration of males, rising status of women, breakdown of extended family relations, and welfare rules are obvious Examples. The war on poverty was perhaps not well formulated to deal with these trends, but even in the absence of the feminization of poverty, the war on poverty would not have succeeded because, as we have shown, it has not even benefited males with low education status. If employment is so important to poverty reduction, it is instructive to look at employment trends since implementation of the war on poverty and Keynesian policies. Employment rates for males over age 20 fell between 1965 and 2000 from 81.2% to 74.1%, while female employment rates rose from 37.7% to 58.7%. In other words, policies to improve workers did not increase their employment, at least in the case of males. In short, we do not see rising employment rates with the implementation of the war on poverty, except among women, and this should not be attributed to the war on poverty. Although affirmative action programs and the women's movement probably played important roles. These trends, however, hide important differences among the population with respect to the interaction of the level of educational attainment and employment. In 1965, the employment rate for high school dropouts aged 24 to 64 was 62%. By 1994, this had fallen to 51%. Footnote 4. All data here are from the U.S. Census Bureau and Bureau of Labor Statistics, reported in Table 8.2 of Wray 2003, page 166, end footnote. The comparable employment rates for high school graduates were nearly 65% in 1965 and 73% in 1994. For those with some college, employment rates were 67% in 1965 and 78% in 1994. And for college graduates, rates rose from 82% in 1965 to 85% in 1994. The probability of gaining employment without a high school diploma has fallen considerably, with barely half of dropouts working. Note that these figures are for the non-institutionalized population. If incarcerated prime age 18 to 44 years, high school dropout males are included, things look very much worse. As Wray 2000 has shown, the 1999 employment rate for prime age high school dropout males falls from 68% to 62% if we include the incarcerated population. For similarly situated black males, the employment rate falls from 46% to 33% if the incarcerated population is included. In sum, the war on poverty had little success at significantly raising employment and reducing poverty rates, at least for those under age 65, especially for the least advantaged males without a high school diploma. There was some improvement for minority racial and ethnic groups, but it is not easy to separate the effects of the war on poverty from the effects of the civil rights movement. The war on poverty had little to do with direct job creation, and as Minskyan had warned, without job creation, the war on poverty would only redistribute poverty. While it is true that those who helped to formulate the war on poverty did hold Keynesian views that maintenance of higher aggregate demand would cause jobs to trickle down to the poor, the war on poverty by itself contained little that would raise aggregate demand, and did not directly create many jobs. In any case, the ability of a rising tide to raise all boats is in doubt, as a study by Brady 2003, as well as work by Pigeon and Wray 2000, demonstrates. In the next section, we examine Minsky's skepticism about the ability of growth to reduce poverty.